Ewan, they've done it again. There's another ridiculously broken video game, and I started looking into this a little bit. I started thinking there must be something going on, and it became one of those like old school 90s movie reveals where it goes all the way to the top, and it's been going on for quite some time. This game I'm talking about is The Walking Dead Destinies, only released on the 17th, only released last week, but it comes from Flux Studio. These are a dev that are known for various sort of small-scale games. They did the Cobra Kai games, which I know have their fans. I wasn't a huge fan of the original game, but still, it felt like they were taking a stab at something bigger, like this idea of you were taking the first 4 seasons of The Walking Dead. And the Destinies game is all about remixing the story. It's about picking all these different branching paths and going from there. It seemed really, really cool. I know that our own beloved Josh Brown was looking forward to it, even though it still looked a little bit spotty back when it was first shown. However, this game is published by Game Mill Entertainment. Now, that name will already send some negative ructions throughout the audience, because apparently they've got a hell of a reputation already anyway. But the thing that came from looking into it, is that Game Mill were also the publisher on the Kong Island, the Rise of Kong Skull Island game, which was already holding the baton for the worst game of 2023. Now, they're also behind something else that I'm going to get to, and there's quite a lot of stuff to sort of break down here, but I think in regards to The Walking Dead and Skull Island, there's already been a deep dive into what happened with Skull Island, various conversations with the developers, anonymous sources, so they could, maintain anonymity across the board. But that game, the Skull Island game, was apparently only in development for a year, according to IGN, and apparently between 1 to 20 people at any given time were working on it, and that was because Game Mill, the publisher, denoted that they only had 1 year to turn it around. Apparently they're known for this. It's mentioned in the write-up by The Verge as well. And the developer of the Skull Island Rise of Kong game is Iguana Bee, known for various other titles as well, but apparently this 1 year turnaround is Game Mill's thing, which, we don't know for sure if that's the case with The Walking Dead, but I feel like because they're kind of known for it, it feels like, some sort of development rush was put into place to get The Walking Dead over the finish line. I mentioned something else in here as well, which is the Avatar Quest for Balance game. I don't know if you're an Avatar fan, but that game finally came out this year. It retells the story, retells the, I was going to say anime, but I guess it's like a Western anime of the show. And that's also a complete sci-fi, just complete frame rate, buggy as hell, etc. Also published by Game Mill. So it's one of those things where the more you look into it, the more you'll realize, and the more you go back over Game Mill's history, they also publish Big Rigs Over the Road Racing, largely known as the worst game of all time. So it's one of those things where I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the developers that have been working with the publisher Game Mill. But quick thoughts on the state of these games.
Well, the first thing you mentioned there was like you were going into the conspiracy brain, so I need to do the venerable JFK, Oliver Stone, anime glasses, Kevin Costner. We're through the looking glass here, people.
Yeah, we're down the nose.
Game Mill have a rep, and also what a fittingly appropriate name for a company that seems to be cranking out licensed titles. We're literally calling ourselves the Game Mill. Like, come on, guys. Where's your inspiration? Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's almost like we've been hyping up recently kind of like the return of the licensed game era. This feels like it's like the specter of the licensed game era that is coming back to haunt us now, and the fact that we can still get people who will be like, hey, let's go to... Just imagining someone at like AMC or whoever owns the Walking Dead license being like, hey, I know a guy who can do us a game in 1 year.
He's done it over in a year, don't worry about it.
He's called Game Mill.
Gregory A. Mill. Yeah, it's one of those things where, and like I said, I'm not specifically saying that the approach to the Rise of Kong game has been applied to these other titles, but I do think it's a little bit sus that the amount of licensed titles that Game Mill have published have all came out in largely the same state. It's one of those things where if you look at The Walking Dead Destinies, that game is obviously suffering from frame rate issues, general performance stuff, but it doesn't feel like even the guts of the stealth systems, the combat model, it doesn't really feel like they were given the time to be fleshed out. And it's a shame because that game has a really cool idea at the core of it. The idea that you could, play as Shane and kill Rick instead at the beginning of the whole saga. Little things like that raised my eyebrows. It's the first 4 seasons of The Walking Dead that they're retelling. But there is a quote from someone who worked for Iguana Bee that was written up by IGN, saying that the developers, this is someone who remains anonymous, but they work for Iguana Bee, saying that overall the developer has a love-hate relationship with their publisher, being Game Mill, because they are the ones who accept and give the project, and Iguana Bee doesn't have the means to develop almost anything on their own because of money. So this just kind of feels like, obviously it's the state of the business to some degree. It feels like something that a lot of smaller scale developers, they'll take on contract work, they'll turn something over with the hopes of turning over something bigger over time. But again, it's quite easy to link those dots. It's quite easy to Charlie Day it. It's quite easy to Saga Anderson it, as an Alan Wake 2 reference, and bring it all together because it seems like Game Mill are very much living up to their name. The other thing to throw in is that they are responsible for the Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl game games. We've had 2 of which in the last 3 years in total. The original one was in 2021. The sequel came out this year. Apparently, the sequel's like better. It feels like it kind of was just the same game again, plus the voice acting. But I remember when that game came out, and it was the same with the Nickelodeon kart racer game. A lot of fans couldn't believe that they didn't shell out to get the voice actors in. They have in part 2, but they didn't in both of those first installments. And that just kind of points to that idea of like, how do we get it over the finish line? How do we turn it over as fast as possible? Which, like you said, ties back into the way that licensed games used to be handled when we had so many of them across the 2000s, but 95% of them were absolute toss.
Yeah, no, it's really bad. And again, the anecdote given there from the person who works for Iguana, be like the idea of like, oh, it's a love-hate relationship because we wouldn't be able to make games on our own without Game Mill's involvement, but they are basically putting us in the content mines and making us, pillage our own resources, which in itself is also living up to the mafia metaphor we have for Gregory Mill that we came up with just before. It's what a rotten situation for those. I mean, the Kong Skull Island speaks for itself. That game is ugly on the surface, and it gets even uglier the closer you scrutinize it. And yeah, I'm shocked. And to be fair, Scott, this might be me throwing shade at Walking Dead fans now. I'm shocked that we're even getting Walking Dead video games in 2023. Really? But based on the first 4 seasons as well. It's like, I know people have nostalgia for that, but like, come on. It was so long ago. We can't...
It's still been going. It's still going. I mean, it lost me around about season 4, season 5, when they started doing all the stuff with, the guy with the eye patch, I forget his name, the governor, I think he was called. That's when it started to lose me. But those first 4 seasons are brilliant. Well-ish. Season 2 is a bit shaky, even as I start thinking about it. But still, if you were going to do some sort of timeline remix game where you can pick all these different character paths, it would be those original titles. However, it's going to need more than a year or a couple of years or whatever to bring that scope together. It's one of those things where you want to give props to the devs for turning something over at all. Like, it's incredible to get a game over the finish line whatsoever. It doesn't excuse the price points that are attached to these things. I noticed some stuff down at the Walking Dead game is being sold for £40. The Rise of Kong game is £35. And the Avatar game is £40. But they're not full price titles. They're not £70. But at the same time, you could be spending your money on a million other things.
Hey, like 40 quid's 40 quid, mate. You got to make those purchasing investments. I picked up RoboCop over the weekend for
you did.
like 50. So it's still that game is great. We can get great licensed games. Studios like Teon are making really good stuff. So. Yeah, I don't know. I really hope that this isn't going to be like, now that we've got the licensed game kind of comeback going on, I hope that this isn't going to be instructive or encouraging to other publishers to basically be like, what can we get away with next? Because even though these games will get mocked quite heavily in the online sphere, they're still big IPs, I'm taking the mick out of The Walking Dead. It's still a legacy franchise with a massive following. It was literally the biggest TV show on the planet like 10 years ago or whatever. So I think it's just a case of them, monopoly or taking advantage of those IPs and trying to get as much stuff out of it. The Kong one is also interesting because we're having a bit of a Kong moment, I guess you could say, again,
the Monarch
currently.
Thing as well.
But it's frustrating because it's like, well, the people who own these licenses should know better, should do their research better, and want to have game companies do right by their licenses, because the more crappy products you put out, the more you diminish them in the video game space. So you could get an amazing Kong game. It's the 2005 movie tie-in game. That one's like really fun. Why don't we have
that thing is still
those?
Infinitely better than the most recent Kong game. Like, it's like that, the Peter Jackson one. I think it was Ubisoft that developed that back then.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
That thing came together a hell of a lot better than anyone ever expected it to be. It's in a couple of our lists recently as well. It's just a game that no one expected to be as good as it was. But yeah, it is an interesting talking point in terms of the return of licensed games, because like they used to be across the 2000s. The attempt was made to develop the game alongside the film schedule to try and turn the game over in the same amount of time it takes to make a film, which hardly ever came together. And I feel like across the 2010s, the idea of the licensed game or the licensed movie tie-in went to mobile. I remember Iron Man 3 being a mobile game after Iron Man, I think it was at least Iron Man 1 was on Xbox 360. And so it's one of those kind of things where they try to find different ways of at least having something available at launch. And it was a weird thing with Marvel and the rollout of the MCU. We didn't get an Avengers game until 2020. It was long, long after. And Star Wars as well didn't have any movie tie-in games apart from the Lego Force Awakens game. And so now that we have this thing where there's the upper echelon of production, like the Indiana Jones game that's coming out, or the Wolverine game or whatever, not necessarily movie tie-ins, but still big IP stuff, it seems like someone like Game Mill is like, hey, I can get a hold of these licenses and I can do something to have, like, I can put something on shelves that'll draw some eyeballs and try and get in that way. but it just hasn't worked. Another one to throw on the pile here in regards to licensed stuff, super quick, is Lord of the Rings Gollum. Just another game that was just an absolute tire fire. But when you look into the development of it, developers Daedalic were very much not known for that type of game. They're sort of a bit more known as a publisher. I absolutely love the Blades of the Shogun games, or the game rather. There's DLC and stuff for it. But still, it's just another thing to throw in there. Like, that game's being sold for £50. Seemed like I had a bit of a development hell. The special edition that came out was charging people for voice acting. It's just, some of that stuff in regards to trying to bring it all together for the licensing just doesn't work.
Yeah, Matt McMuscles did a really, really good, I mean, shout out to him. He did a really, really good video on his What Happened series on Lord of the Rings Gollum that really dives into, like, the Elvish voice acting DLC and how, Daedalic Tiny Team were basically, brought into this lofty plan for like the Lord of the Rings IP and stuff. I don't know. It's it's still a case that publishers are looking at these franchises and licenses and correctly getting dollar signs in their eyes, because these are huge, entertainment, properties that can leverage an audience outside of the traditional gaming sphere. But you just gotta hope that people, because the way that Game Mill has been operating, you're right, like, it's kind of been coasting under the radar. We've had these kind of middling, nothing, straight to bad releases. And that's probably because, they're not selling exceptionally well, but they're probably selling enough for them to make a little profit. Which is still worth raising here. There's my heart goes out to the developers that are kind of like working on these games, because they're not being given the facilities to make them, the best things possible. But it's important to kind of, look at them and acknowledge their badness, because otherwise they'll just keep doing this. And then some, casual fan or, casual gamer who happens to like The Walking Dead or happens to like King Kong will go, oh, there's a new Walking Dead and King Kong game. And, it's brand new, but maybe I'll get it anyway. So it's important to highlight the mischievousness going on here.
Yeah. And it's worth completely crystallizing the fact that there's, you can laugh or whatever at some of the screenshots and some of the animations and whatever. That's not the overall point. The overall point here is hopefully to be able to give the developers or whoever's making those negotiations more ammunition to say, look what happens when you don't give us enough time, when you don't allow us to bring these things together, like what happened in the Cyberpunk situation. Eventually, over time, they were sort of given more, like I said, ammunition to have those conversations and just say, look, we need more time, Arthur, to be able to bring stuff over the finish line. So hopefully that's the case going forward with people who are working with Game Mill, because the more you look into them as a publisher, the more you realize the amount of games that were pushed around too fast. I can't think what phrase I'm going for here. Pushed over the line too fast. You know what I mean.
The flower's got weevils in it, Scott.
They do every single time, but hopefully that stuff works out better going forward.